and my guest is online. Welcome, Gaurav. Maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience, like who you are, what do you do for AWS?
Absolutely, Nivas. Thank you for having me on the show. Hey, everyone. I'm a senior product manager for the Control Tower team. And as Nivas mentioned, I've worked in the past life and I was a solutions architect with Nivas within the control services team as well.
So Gaurav and I go long back.
Okay, cool. So I kind of started off with a brief overview of Control Tower, but for our viewers who have never heard of Control Tower, what's kind of like the 101 with Control Tower? Let's start there.
And I'll let Gaurav answer that,
Yeah.
and then I'll chime in.
Hey, Jeff, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah,
Sure.
let's start off with the 101. What is Control Tower? And for someone who's never heard of what it is, because it's not S3, it's not EC2, it's not something you kind of run a workload
Absolutely.
on. What exactly is it?
So, in a nutshell, Jeff, Control Tower is a well-architected multi-account environment based on security and compliance best practices. Control Tower automates setup of a landing zone based on best practice blueprints for your identity, federated access, and account structure. And if I were to mention some notable features of Control Tower, it also automates creation of new accounts with built-in governance. It enforces best practices, standards, and regulatory requirements with pre-configured controls, and it also seamlessly integrates with third-party softwares at scale to enhance your Control Tower AWS environment.
Yeah, that's great. And Gaurav, maybe you can talk to the audience about what does landing zone mean? Like, where does that term come from, and what's the history behind it?
So, so Control Tower itself is a landing zone, right? And the history that pertains to landing zone within AWS, it comes from back in 2017, 2018. And anyone, so landing zone is a very generic term, right? Any customer that wants to get started on AWS that has needs for management and governance across a multi-account environment basically starts with a landing zone. A um, couple of features that customers look for out of the box when they talk about landing zone is basically having logging setup for CloudTrail or config, for example, having a way for them to vend new AWS accounts within an organization, right? Having some core accounts where you can set up your logging, having a security account where you can sort of host your security tools or use that account as dedicated admins for different AWS services. So that altogether put together is sort of loosely defined as a landing zone. And as I said, Control Tower itself sets up a landing zone which provides those features out of the box.
So it makes it quite simple for audiences to do a few click deployments of a landing zone.
It
Is that
does exactly. And as we were talking about the history of landing zone, right? Back in 2017, 2018, when I started working as a ProServe consultant and started working on landing zones, we discovered that with all the architecture that I just explained, customers were taking anywhere between few weeks to months to set up that, landing zone or that structure. And fast forward to 2019 when we launched Control Tower to provide those capabilities out of the box, the time was condensed within a few minutes. So as of today, if you were to deploy a landing zone with Control Tower, it takes somewhere around 30 to 40 minutes with everything that comes out of the box.
Yeah. And by the way, Gaurav, I'm getting excited just listening to you talk about some of the services I support and specialize in. But please.
Okay, so we've established what Control Tower is, how it makes an operations infrastructure job easier, managing all of your accounts. So what's new with Control Tower? What are you here to share with us today?
Absolutely, Jeff. I'm here to talk about our most recent launch of a comprehensive controls management. But before I go into the feature itself, let me try to define the problem statement that we are trying to tackle or solve with that feature, right? So as customers begin to use AWS services, many take an allow list approach, meaning only allowing use of AWS services that that are vetted and approved for their production usage, right? So that they can balance their security and compliance needs with the need to be agile. So what that does is that it restricts developer access until risks are defined and controls implemented, which can take anywhere between few weeks to months, right? So to put that problem statement into perspective, it takes anywhere from at least 2 to on an average 3 weeks for a service to be assessed and approved for production usage. And in fact, one of our customers took around 18 months to perform service due diligence of 24 services. So with Control Tower's comprehensive controls management launch, where we include over 300 controls, which are mapped to most common control objectives and frameworks. So this comprehensive controls management reduces the time that customers take to vet a new AWS service from weeks to minutes. And we do that by undertaking the burden of defining, managing, and mapping controls to these most common control objectives, such as enforcing least privilege, data encryption at rest, and restrict network access. And lastly, with this feature, customers can programmatically implement controls at scale within their multi-account environment, which allows customers to quickly vet, allow list, and begin using AWS services.
Sure. So let me ask you a little bit more on that one, Gaurav, just to help.
Sure.
Um, on the controls, so when you talk about control objectives,
Mhm.
can you give us a few more examples of what enterprises might be doing to, like, what are some examples of control objectives?
Sure, of course. Let's define control objective to begin with. So, control objective is a target to be achieved by means of implementing controls and configurations within your control tower environment. So, in other words, a control objective is a high level conceptual objective that usually requires group of controls working together, and it can be thought of as a highest common denominator across industry best practices, compliance frameworks, and internal policies. And when we talk about some of the examples of control objectives, which we are going to see during our demo as well, we have around 14 control objectives that our 300 plus controls map to. Um, some of the common ones being enforcing least privilege, right? Customers want to make sure that they're providing access to their developers and engineers only for the things that they need, right? So that you're enforcing the least privilege pattern for access to your engineers. Another one being data encryption at rest, which is also a very common control objective, where customers want to make sure that any data that they have, let's say in an S3 bucket or DynamoDB, it is encrypted by default. So when you use these controls that Control Tower has, we have mapped certain controls to these objectives, and when you enable these controls, you're basically meeting these control objectives.
Excellent. Excellent. So these controls, I guess, are in the form of service control policies, AWS config rules, and then you also
Absolutely.
launched a new set of controls recently.
We did. Thank you for bringing that up. So, on a very high level, Control Tower's comprehensive controls management has three categorizations of controls or three types of controls. The first two that you mentioned was preventive controls, which are implemented using service control policies. Other is defective controls, which are implemented using config rules and controls that are sourced from security hub. And a new type of control, which is a proactive control, which is a cloud formation hook based control. And we have added over 125 of these controls to our controls library. So now what that is, right? What is a proactive control? So proactive control allows customers to control which services can be launched and how those services are configured during provisioning time. And additionally, proactive controls allows customers to disallow actions that lead to policy violations, and it blocks deployment of non-compliant resources at scale.
Gotcha, Grav. When I hear a lot of talk about controls,
Mhm.
working with the government as I do, you hear you can't go into a meeting and not talk about security controls. And actually, the enterprise I worked at before I was with AWS was in the PCI payment card industry section, which also has a whole different its own set of controls. So I
Right.
imagine these controls with Control Tower will help you with both say like PCI control sets. Is that one of the sets that's available?
It will. It will. So as of today, Control Tower has Control Tower's controls are aligned or mapped to three compliance frameworks. One of them being the PCI DSS framework, and the other two being the NIST, which is NIST framework, and the CIS AWS benchmark.
Yeah, those are three big ones. You would not know how many times I've had to say 800-53 in the last 2 years. And I think this is something that sometimes this is the hard part. Setting up a workload and getting it running and test, that's one thing. But then meeting all of these controls, number one, knowing what the controls are and having an auditor kind of check them, but then implementing them, proving that you've met them. It sounds like Control Tower and this new feature is going to help with all of that.
It absolutely will, right? And as I mentioned earlier, by undertaking the burden of doing this control mapping to these control objectives, mapping to compliance frameworks, we have reduced the time that customers take to start using any AWS service significantly, right? So customers can now, by enabling these controls, by basically looking at the mappings that we have within our comprehensive controls management feature, customers can just start enabling these controls and start determining which services or which use cases are compliant and which are non-compliant based on the artifacts that are attached to each of these controls that we publish.
Yeah, it's one thing to say, oh, here's some documentation on how to meet these controls, and then you have this piece of paper someone printed out, and you go through a checklist. Okay, did I enable this setting? Okay, did I enable this setting? But having these built in the Control Tower with policies, service control policies, just makes it easier. Grav, can you show us this in action? Can we see exactly how we work with these
Absolutely.
controls?
All right, let's do it.
And yeah, that's one of the main benefits of Control Tower. Like you don't need to think about how to set up the controls. You just set
They're
up
there.
and you're there.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So where I am at right now is the Control Tower console itself, and I'm at the dashboard of the Control Tower console, as you can see. Now, when we're talking about comprehensive controls management, on the left-hand side, under controls library, we have added two new pages. First one being categories. So let's quickly take a look at what categories have we mapped our controls to. As you can see on a very high level, we have three categorizations of the controls that we have mapped with them to. First one being control objectives, which we just talked about. And as you can see, right now we have controls mapped to 14 of these control objectives. And these are the objective names. For example, encrypt data at rest that we talked about. And corresponding to that, we have 29 controls out of our 350 plus controls that we have that are being mapped to this specific control objective. So if you click on that, you have all the controls that map to this objective, and then customers can quickly take a look at which services these controls are mapped to, and correspondingly which control objective are these controls mapped to, and start sort of exploring these controls or enabling these controls.
Sure. And Gara,
Now,
quick question on that.
mhm.
I noticed, you also have a CloudFormation guard rule. Can you speak a little bit to us about how that works?
Absolutely. So let's take an example of this very first control that I see here. And if you take a look at the naming convention of this control, so let me click on this. The naming convention of this control is CT, which is Control Tower. API Gateway would be the service that the control is implemented for. PR basically means it's a proactive control, which is the new control type that we have added. And dot three is just a number for it's a number third control within the API Gateway service. Now, the way these controls work is based off of CloudFormation hooks and guard policies. So if I scroll down on this control and I click on the artifacts, This is the CloudFormation Guard rule. And what that does is that CloudFormation Guard rule lays out the intent of this control as to why this control is implemented. It lays out the use case for this control as to when can a customer use this specific control. So click on this and it lays out the use case. It gives you the scenarios in which you can use this control over here, right? So for this specific control, we have 6 scenarios, and the scenarios are basically broken down into when a control will fail and when this control specifically will pass, right? And corresponding to this gherkin, that's what we call it. We also have a compliant and a non-compliant resource template. So if I click onto the non-compliant resource template, it is basically a CloudFormation resource template that engineers on customers' environment basically can use, plug this into CloudFormation, and they can test in which scenarios that this control will fail by using this resource. And by using the compliant template, you can test in which scenarios will this control pass or basically will be deemed as a compliant resource deployment.
Gaurav, although I'm on the same team, I didn't even know that that existed. So now I know that you can actually test it out.
Yep.
Yeah, and Gaurav, and I like right in the center of the screen there, you can see for this control, you have framework, and it looks like this applies to both NIST 800-53 and the PCI specific version 321 there. So it's nice to know that you can see what framework this is part of, because that's a lot of people are going to be only concerned with PCI. A lot of people are only going to be concerned with NIST, HIPAA, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's it's nice that you're correlating.
Exactly, and I think it's a very nice feature in the way that we have eliminated the redundancy that some controls span across different compliance frameworks, right? So by providing this information to the customers can directly see as to which, as you said, which framework does the control map to, and accordingly just start using the control.
So if I had to summarize it, Gaurav, then we could say that the proactive controls will, especially the ones with CloudFormation Guard, will prevent the provisioning of non-compliant CloudFormation templates.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep. Just to quickly go back to the categories page, we've already covered control objectives. However, I also want to highlight two other categories that we have mapped the controls to. One being services. And as you can see here, customers also have an option to look at all the controls that Control Tower provides and how they map to each service that we support today in terms of controls deployment, and how many of those control objectives does that control align to, right? So for example, for API gateway, we have 9 controls and it maps to 5 control objectives that we saw earlier. So I think it's a very useful piece of information when customers want to quickly look at the controls that that map to a specific AWS service, right? And then lastly, we already talked about, we have frameworks. If I click on, let's say, NIST framework, it gives me all the controls, which is 344, by the way, here, that is mapped to the NIST framework.
So Gaurav, let's talk about pricing. Is there any extra cost to this? How does that work into utilizing this new feature of Control Tower?
So there is no additional pricing as far as Control Tower is concerned. Even previously, Control Tower did not charge for anything that customers are working with in Control Tower. However, when you enable a control, the underlying service that the control is based off of is charged, right? So for example, in case of proactive controls, we are utilizing CloudFormation hooks. So customers will be charged for the CloudFormation hooks, but they won't be charged for utilizing a control that Control Tower provides.
And so, for example, if it's a control around data encryption, there might be, like, a specific cost for the encryption, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously you would have paid for that if Control Tower enabled it or not, or checked for it for you or not. But the act of checking and keeping track of all the controls, there's no, that's nice that there's no extra cost for that. Yeah,
Exactly.
Because there are organizations and companies that are specifically created to go through the audit process, to collect all of your evidence and prepare for that audit meeting, that week-long audit, usually, especially with a PCI company. So I could just see how this is going to save specifically the cloud organization a lot of time, especially with PCI compliance. So this is really exciting.
Yeah, and Jeff, you're absolutely right there, because I mean, with Control Tower, you get that dashboard. So you get that visibility of all of your controls that Gaurav just showed us, but it's across the entire multi-account environment. And that's so helpful, especially if you're like an administrator for this enterprise environment, or maybe even for startups, like you're setting up your secure environment for the first time. How do you do it in a one click or a couple of clicks?
Yeah. And it's one thing to maybe set up 3 accounts the same way. And maybe that's a little harder when you start to set up maybe 10 accounts the same way. But some corporations, when you have hundreds of accounts, being able to control it all in one organization. Now we're adding the compliance, all the controls to all of those 100+ accounts. I can see where the value is there.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Gaurav, what's the difference between Control Tower and AWS Config proactive controls?
Sure. So, Jeff, both features utilize or implement checks on resource configurations prior to provisioning, but for different use cases. Control Tower's proactive controls are used to meet specific control objectives that we talked about, and Control Tower's proactive controls block deployment of non-compliant resources at scale. Whereas for config's feature utilizes the subset of existing config detected checks as proactive checks, and it does not block deployment of non-compliant resources.
Okay.
So that's the biggest difference between the two, and customers wishing to have a more comprehensive controls management to definitely look into Control Tower's proactive controls.
Gotcha. All right, so Gaurav, thanks for all the information you shared with us. This is really exciting. I see a lot of people using this, especially a lot of the customers I interact with. Is there anything else you'd like to share about this new feature before we're done?
I think I've covered pretty much everything. I'm just excited that we've launched this, and thank you so much for having me on your show.
And Gaurav, one quick question: how do we get started on it?
So you basically, I can post a link to it as well. But you can basically, once you have launched Control Tower, as I screen shared, right? You can either use console, or you can also use APIs for all of our controls, and we also support CloudFormation resources for controls deployment.
Awesome. And yeah, we'll post some links on the Twitch channel.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Gaurav. Thanks again, and thanks for all the reviews, for questions. And Gaurav, let's catch up again sometime soon.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jeff.
It was great to see you here.
Likewise, Nivas.
Thanks.
All right, take care.